what are we listening to today?
The Immigrant Project by Girish and Astha.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Immigrant Project. Today we have an immigration lawyer with us with nearly 4 decades of experience. Joel Guberman has license to practice law in US and Canada. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let's start with the most basic question first. You have around 40 years of experience practicing law. What is the most, or rather, I want to say, biggest problem people come to you with related to immigration?
Well, that's an interesting question. And in North America, both in the United States and Canada, the systems are designed ostensibly to bring people into their countries. But the biggest problem in a phrase is navigating the system. The changes that are made constantly, the little nuances that happen almost on a weekly basis, both in Canada and the United States, make it near impossible for people to navigate the system independently. Even for lawyers, the changes that are made, the little tweaks that are made to the system constantly, the number of different options that are available or not available, the limits to immigration in the United States, the limits in Canadian immigration are so baffling to most people that employers and people coming to work in both Canada and the United States are baffled by the whole system.
Limits? What sort of limits?
Well, there's quotas in the United States. There's country quotas. There's visa type quotas. Canada doesn't have quotas so much. We have a target, which we've seemed to have met many times over the last many years. Some of the problems that we're facing is Canada seems to think that we're overreaching our targets, but those limits backlog systems to such a huge extent. And I should have said at the outset, backlogs are the nemesis of almost everybody, both employers, employees, people coming to Canada and the United States. If you look some of the categories in the United States, it's a joke. For example, sponsorship of brothers and sisters, which is permitted, 15-year backlog. What's the point? It's ridiculous. So that's a challenge.
I want to talk about the targets government set in Canada in terms of immigration, but to your point of immigration in the US and some of the challenges, I was speaking to a friend a couple of days back, and he said to apply for a green card, especially if you're an Indian, you'll have to wait for 60 plus years. Is it true?
Well, it depends which category. So That's exactly what I'm talking about. In the category, if you're being sponsored by a brother or sister of a U.S. citizen, the backlog is in excess of 15 years.
Wow.
If you're being sponsored in one of the employment-based categories, it can certainly be 5, 6, 7, 10 years, depending on which category you're falling into. Yes,
Wow.
And India, because there are certain country quotas in the United States, in addition to visa quotas that apply to everybody in the world, India, with a huge population, necessarily has a bigger backlog than, say, a smaller country, Ireland or Italy or something like that.
Wow. And Joel, in your professional expertise, which country do you think is managing immigration better? Because I know Canada has a targeted approach, whereas US has like a raffle sort of a system.
That is a very interesting question, because I split my practice sort of 50-50 between Canada and US immigration. I think the perception is that Canada's system is the easier to navigate. I would differ.
Okay.
I think the United States system is, albeit subjective to some extent, is an easier and more cut and dried system. The rules are set. They follow them to a certain extent. Canada seems a little more fluid in how it does things, and I find the paperwork involved in Canadian immigration almost insurmountable in many cases.
Really? Wow. So a couple of years back, when I was planning to move to Canada, I heard Sean Fraser, who was the then immigration minister, talk about how they wanted to reach targets of around 500,000 of immigrants each year. And now, a couple of months back, I heard news that government is cutting down on the levels of immigration, and this is mostly affecting a lot of temporary foreign workers in the country.
Right.
Do you think this move is a good move economically for the government?
Okay, well, there's two different things going on. The levels are permanent resident immigration. The temporary foreign workers don't come into that number. So
500,000 number.
Yeah, so the temporary foreign worker programs the various programs don't affect the numbers of the targets for permanent residents in Canada. Yes, the government is probably lowering the permanent resident targets as well. They've been significantly high. But to answer your question about the temporary foreign worker program, um, to be blunt, I think it's somewhat ill-conceived. It's a typical government knee-jerk reaction to what they perceive as a problem and then throwing darts at that problem. I say typical, I think, because I want to back up on that statement.
Yeah.
Over the last 20 years, I think Canada's had an excellent system of immigration that worked quite well. Is it perfect? Not by
No.
any stretch
Yeah.
of the imagination. Is it laden with paperwork and online glitches and all kinds of stuff? Sure. 20 years ago, they were throwing darts at problems, and this is one of those things.
I know some countries might, want to emulate the immigration system that Canada has in place. But in my personal opinion, I feel the government might be doing this is because they want to be in, it's probably as a vote bank or something for election cycles coming up. So that is my personal opinion.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that. I mean, I think the government knows there's a major housing crisis. The government knows in both countries there's a fair anti-immigrant sentiment, far greater in the United States than in Canada, but it's rising. So to appear to crack down on ostensibly temporary foreign workers is it's maybe a political move. That's I hadn't really thought of that, but I think that's a valid point. Yeah.
Thanks, Joel. So a lot of our listeners are immigrants to Canada and into the US especially. They are temporary foreign workers. So I was reading a stat recently, and the stat said that Canada is a service industry, service economy, and we get 72% of our GDP from services, and only 2% of it or less probably comes from agriculture. Whereas agriculture is probably a sector where we need more labor. So,
right.
So do you think the government's move of cutting down on temporary foreign workers and allowing them work permit of only probably a year or so restricts this?
But they cut down on temporary foreign workers on various sectors, but the agricultural sector has not been cut back on. So that's been hived out as a separate section. And there are only certain limits on the healthcare workers situation, construction workers. They haven't eliminated those at all. And they really haven't eliminated temporary foreign workers at the low wage level. What they've done is set a target. So if somebody's applying in an area where the unemployment rate is higher than 6%,
okay,
then you can't hire a temporary foreign worker in the low wage sector. If it's below 6%, you can. So that gives it some leeway.
Do you think this decision from the government would end up affecting the employers because they will not have access to as many workers as they probably would?
Well, not my opinion, but one I read recently in a newspaper, which was well thought out. Basically, they said, why don't we leave the labor market alone and let it find its own level? Why, are we a pure socialist country where the government controls every nuance of our lives? We're not. Or are we a capitalist society? Well, we're both. But in the labor market situation, I tend to agree, let it find its own level. If you can't find workers in Canada, and if you can bring people in, this notion that temporary foreign workers lower the wages of Canadians in the United States has this same misconception is nonsense. Because in order to bring in a temporary foreign worker, we have to meet certain wage guidelines, which are the same guidelines that any Canadian would have. And to bring in a temporary foreign worker by an employer costs 10 times as much as hiring a Canadian. Because, well, you got to bring them here.
Yeah.
You have to pay for them to be here. You have to go through the labor market impact assessment process. It's an expensive process. So why would any legitimate employer want to bring in a foreign worker if they could actually find a Canadian to do the job? It's sort of a nonsensical thought.
Wow. Yeah, that does make sense. I also have a separate question for you. I want to draw comparisons to how the US manages immigration versus how Canada manages immigration. So I have seen, and I'm no expert, Joel, like you, but I've seen that Canadian provinces have a lot of influence into the number or the kind of people that are coming to the province,
Yes.
as compared to the states where I don't think the federal government has the say, whereas the provincial or the state government not as much, because they are dealing with illegal immigrants by themselves.
You're absolutely correct. There is no input in the bringing into people, so I say the immigration, the dealing with refugees and how various cities deal with it and whether they are designated refugee zones and that sort of stuff is obviously local. But in terms of the entire immigration program, it's federal in the United States, which is very interesting since the political climate is to download so much to the state jurisdiction immigration. It has never even been suggested that that be the case. Now, various border states, southern border states, have tried to take it upon themselves to build in rules. Texas, for example, wanted to have its own immigration rules to sort of guard the border, but they got knocked down. Canada, on the other hand, has offloaded some of its responsibility to the provinces, but that's a fairly recent development. The provincial nominee program, historically, it's a recent development. I'm guessing, but I'd say that's only been around for 20 years, and immigration's been around a lot longer than that. So the provinces didn't really have much say up until then.
But do you think that when provinces have so much control, it does help the immigration system of a country, especially in the case of Canada?
I think it adds to the diversity of Canada. I mean, there was no secret in the last 20, 25 years that the majority of immigrants were coming to Vancouver and Toronto. So when other provinces have some control and it allows people to come to the country other than Toronto and Vancouver, it's not a bad thing. Sure, it spreads out the immigration wealth, if you can call it that, and I do, over the provinces.
The reason I asked you this question is because I am a big advocate of PNP program, and I came through the PNP program to Canada. So yeah, I really appreciate the interference of provincial government.
But it goes right back to your first question about what are the complications, what makes it difficult, what are the challenges? Well, the challenges every single PMP program is different.
Yeah.
So you've got 10 provinces with 10 completely different programs. You think the 10 provinces could sit down and have a uniform program that would make it so everybody would understand it, and the difference is location? No.
I know. I want to talk about a point that you mentioned a couple of minutes back about Texas having its own immigration system.
Tried.
Yeah, there was news that was floating around a couple of months or maybe more back. Of course, US is bombarded with illegal immigrants in the country. Texas governor is fed up of people that are entering the country through the border of Mexico, and they're trying to ship people off to different cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, etc.
Right.
So, since you practice in the States, what is the number one case that you see, the number one reason for these immigrants to apply for like a permanent, I don't know, card or in the States? How do these immigrants turn from illegal immigrants to legal immigrants in the States?
Well, that's a very complex problem, and it's a different type of immigration that I practice.
Okay.
You're largely talking about refugees.
Okay.
Either economic refugees or true refugees who fear persecution in the countries they're coming from. And to a large extent, I believe that to be true. The shift from illegal immigrant who crosses the border, the southern borders, to permanent resident status is, as you are aware, almost impossible. I mean, it creates an underground economy. It creates an underground illegal situation. The DACA program. We're not going to get into it. The Dreamers. I mean, it's been around for 30 years. They still haven't resolved it in any meaningful way. There's still thousands floating out there without any permanent status. So, I mean, it's a huge problem in the United States. But there's a flip side to that problem. It's grown bigger over the last decade. There's no question about that. With strife in South America, Central America, and economic hardships, that's created a huge problem. But to some extent, the Southern economy and California's economy would collapse if it weren't for a lot of these illegal workers who do all kinds of jobs that Americans just won't do.
So the government is aware that there is a problem of illegal immigrants, but if they do something about it, it might affect
If
the
they do
economy.
something about it in a very major way,
Okay.
like not to get political, but if there's mass deportations,
Hmm.
you might have mass problems with getting
Oh,
things done.
wow. I want to spend some time talking about refugees. You mentioned that term
Not my area of expertise,
No, okay.
but go ahead.
Yeah, let's have a very surface level conversation. Again, Canada is a welcoming country, and we have welcomed a lot of refugees in the country. But there is a growing sentiment amongst the population that maybe we are accepting a lot of refugees than we can probably sustain. Do you think that is true,
No.
or it just hate against
No, I
refugees?
don't. I mean, I think typically that's a notion that countries have that have legal immigration, that want immigration. I say Canada and the United States fit that bill. We don't absorb percentage wise anything near what the countries in Europe do. Germany.
Okay.
Yeah, thousands of times percentage wise what we do in Canada and the United States. Now, the United States does have a border problem because it's accessible. But if you're a refugee, getting to Canada is not an easy task. I mean, if you get to Canada, you really want to get to Canada. And one would presume, in most of the cases, these are legitimate claims.
Okay.
And Canada is a welcoming place. So to take in Syrian refugees, as we did, and other war-torn parts of the world,
Ukrainians.
I mean, I think it's an obligation of us. Now, the numbers we have to be vetted. There has to be security. One has to be careful. But
Yeah.
do we take in too many? The perception that we take in too many is always there. That hasn't changed this year, last year, or 25 or 30 years ago. Everybody always thought we were taking in too many people. You may not recall, but I'm guessing about 35, maybe 40 years ago,
Yeah.
it was Vietnamese boat people.
Oh.
That was the big problem. And there was a few thousand people. So the perception that we're always taking in too many refugees is always there.
Wow, I did not know that Europe takes more than what Canada
Per capita,
Per
or
capita.
even in raw numbers.
Wow.
Absolutely.
So Germany, you mentioned Germany, and it's a very interesting point that comes to my mind after read something about Germany is that they are going through a very hard time economically. They're not doing well, and Canada is also facing through a similar problem. Of course, we are one of the worst off when it comes to G7 economies, and we are facing a productivity challenge.
Right.
I'm sure you must have heard about this. So, do you think that immigration can be attributed because of this
I wouldn't.
hardship?
I would not attribute productivity to the immigrant experience. I would. There have been studies, nothing I know of in the last couple of years, but there have certainly been studies that have shown that the immigrant population is far more productive than the static population, if I can call it that, or the landed population, or the population that's been here for years and years. There's no question that statistics have shown that immigrants work harder, get more done, and are more productive. So how could that be creating the problem?
No, I definitely believe that immigrants do add a lot of value to the economy, any country that they come at.
I mean, immigrants by and large, I would say 99.9% of the time, are seeking Canada and the United States to better their lot in life, to make things better for themselves. Well, you're not going to come to a country and sit around and do nothing if you want to better your life. That just doesn't make any sense.
I have a very interesting question for you, Joel, and we were talking about this off the camera on how's the sentiment like in the States, especially when election is around the corner. You must be hearing a lot from your clients, potential clients, about moving to Canada, moving to States. What do you think is the sentiment there?
Let me do the non-political answer
Yeah.
first. The interesting thing is that there's a very significant movement, not tens of thousands of people, but a large number of people who are looking to move from Canada to the United States. Weather is a factor, although I don't know whether I'd move to Florida with all the hurricanes just now, but people want to move to Florida, Arizona, the Sun Belt states, fed up with weather, People comment on the economy in Canada, the government, they're not happy with it. They didn't like the way the pandemic was dealt. So there's a significant movement to the United States. The flip side, the point that you were raising, the political climate in the United States, does it affect immigration to Canada? And as I told you, it's an interesting phenomenon. When various presidential elections come up, every once in a while, there is a very large segment of the United States that clamors to come to Canada. I use the word clamors carefully because there's phone calls. We get them. My colleagues get them. We have to move to Canada. It'll be a disaster if such and such a person gets into power. It's a tempest in a teapot. Even in the first term of President Trump, where lots and lots of people were saying, we have to get out of here, we have to get out of here, they actually don't get out of the United States. Nothing really happens. And this was true as far back as when Bush was elected, Bush the elder, Bush the younger. There's noise. It's just that.
Wow, it's just noise.
Yeah.
Joel, since you are an expert in the American immigration law as well, I have a few friends. They talk to me about moving to the US.
Sure.
And while H-1B visa is one of the ways that they think they can move, there's also another visa category called O, or outstanding visa.
Well, there's a lot more than that.
So they think that O is the second best option that they have. Do you think it's a viable option for them to explore?
Well, it's funny you should ask that question because I absolutely detest the O1 visa. I think it's it is the most subjective, nonsensical visa they have got in the U.S. lexicon.
Wow.
So let's back up a step and let's pretend we're actually dealing with a case of one of your friends. First of all, are they Canadian citizen now, or are they permanent residents? That makes a big difference.
Okay.
Let's assume they're Canadian citizens because it makes a much bigger and broader situation. Under the Free Trade Agreement, there's a TN visa. Professionals, 60 different professionals can get very easy access to the United States if given a job. I mean, engineers, computer systems analysts, all kinds of scientists, management consultants. You can be in the United States with a 3-year work permit in a matter of days. So that's a very, very easy ticket that almost no one else in the world has. Mexicans under the Free Trade Agreement have that, but it's a much more complicated process. Ours is port of entry, you're gone. We do lots of that. And the same is in reverse. Americans coming to Canada. Very quick and simple. There's also a very big visa, which happens to be my favorite. Part of the Free Trade Agreement is called an E-visa.
E-visa.
There's an E1 and an E2. Imagine this. If you have a Canadian business owned by Canadians that sells goods or services to the United States, that could be management consulting services, that could be computer system services, that could be social media services. If you sell that to the United States, then you can get an E1 visa that's good for 5 years that allows you to go to the United States, live in the United States, and increase the cross-border trade. So I favor those visas vastly over the O1.
So you would suggest anyone to go with the E-visa?
Well, I mean, it depends on their situation. And the problem, the E is beautiful because it doesn't require a U.S. employer. You can be self-employed in Canada and still get an E-visa. The O visa is a complex visa, 3 components to it. The easy part, as you probably know, the O stands for is extraordinary ability visa. So the easy part is showing that you're extraordinary. There's fairly basic criteria. If you meet them, you'll meet them. Fine. Then you need a no objection letter from a union or a regulatory body or in the United States. And then you have to have a petitioner. That petitioner doesn't have to be an employer, but if it's not an employer, then it has to be an agent. So it's a job offer. And to go back to criteria 1, you've got to be extraordinary. I'm not in love with the visa.
It's too difficult. You did mention that Mexico and Free Trade Agreement, but wasn't NAFTA dissolved and it was replaced by something called as
ASMCA?
Yeah, right.
Or CUSMA, depending on if you're from Canada, it's CUSMA. If you're from the United States, it's ASMCA because what comes first, the Canada or the U.S.
Of course.
Interesting question. Much along the lines of what happens in the political climate in the United States. So much ado about the Free Trade Agreement. They changed the name. As far as the immigration criteria, not one word was changed.
Wow.
Not a word.
Wow. So
That
everything stands. It's just a name.
every single thing stood, not one iota of a change. Now, that's just the immigration provisions. We know dairy farmers were affected, and there's other trade aspects to the free trade agreement. But in terms of immigration, again, major panic, including ourselves. What was going to happen? All these people on TN visas, all these, were they going to fall? Nothing happened. Zero.
CUSMA is up for renewal next year, I suppose. Do you think it'll be renewed?
Well, I guess it depends who's in power.
That's true. That's true.
Well, and I'm not even sure what that means. I mean, President Trump negotiated what we have now. We don't know what a President Harris will do.
That is so true. Yeah. Well, I hope she makes the right decision. Joel, we have time for one last question, and our last question for you is: if there's an immigrant who's planning to come to the U.S. or Canada next year, what advice would you give them?
Well, we have to look at credentials to determine which is going to be the easier country to get to. You also have to ask the individual
Let's talk
concerned.
about student.
Sorry?
Student. Let's talk about student, because there are a lot of students that are moving out of.
Well, as you know, there's been a change to the student program in Canada. That's one of the major changes, and maybe one of the better changes. I think students were given a bit of a raw deal on the Canadian side if they went to the wrong school.
Yeah.
A student, it's a toughie. I would probably opt for Canada. I think the opportunities post-graduation are much greater. If you're not in the STEM program in the United States, you only get 1 year of postgraduate work. If in Canada it's up to 3, that gives you significant opportunity for permanent residence status. In the United States, basically, if you're a student, your opportunities for permanent status were fairly dependent on an H1, and as you know, that's a lottery. It's about a 1 in
Lottery, yeah.
5 chance. I would give Canada the edge.
Wow.
Now, as to where the better schools are, that's a different question.
Yeah. Oh, of course. I would go with US in terms of better schools. Well, this has been fantastic, Joel. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.